My name is Amber Mitchell, and I'm 27 years old. All my life, I've lived in the shadow of my perfect older sister, Heather. Growing up, nothing I did was ever good enough for my father. Last month, when I finally swallowed my pride and asked for help with rent, his words cut deeper than any knife. Your sister is successful and responsible unlike you, doesn't need help. Little did he know that the golden child's perfect life was about to shatter into a million pieces. Before I continue my story, let me know where you're watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you've ever felt like the disappointing child in your family, and stick around to see how I finally stood my ground. I grew up in a seemingly picture-perfect family in suburban Boston. My father, James Mitchell, built his reputation as one of the city's most formidable attorneys, known for his razor-sharp mind and even sharper expectations. He worked at a prestigious firm downtown, climbing the ranks through sheer determination and an unwavering work ethic he expected his children to inherit. My mother, Catherine, had been an elementary school teacher before I was born, but she gave up her career to raise us. She was softer than my father, but ultimately, she always deferred to his judgment, especially when it came to parenting decisions. Then there was my sister, Heather. 5 years older than me and seemingly perfect in every way possible. She was the kind of student teachers used as an example for other kids. Straight A's since kindergarten, captain of the debate team by sophomore year, class president, and recipient of just about every academic award possible. She had this way of making everything look effortless, from solving complex math equations to delivering flawless speeches at school assemblies. My father's eyes would light up whenever she entered a room. I, on the other hand, was a different story entirely. Where Heather excelled at structure and rules, I was all creative chaos. School was a constant struggle, not because I wasn't smart, but because my mind worked differently. I couldn't sit still, couldn't focus on subjects that didn't capture my imagination, and couldn't seem to please my teachers no matter how hard I tried. When I was 12, after years of parent-teacher conferences and academic struggles, I was finally diagnosed with ADHD. My father's response? That's just an excuse for not trying hard enough. One memory stands out particularly clearly. My 10th birthday party had been planned for weeks, a small gathering with a few friends at our house. That same morning, Heather received news that she'd won a prestigious regional science competition. Within hours, my birthday became an afterthought. The cake remained in the refrigerator while my parents took Heather out for a celebratory dinner. My friends and I ate pizza in the basement, supervised by a hastily arranged babysitter. When they returned, my father barely acknowledged my party, too busy calling relatives about Heather's achievement. "This is going to look fantastic on her college applications," I overheard him telling my uncle on the phone, beaming with pride. Meanwhile, I blew out candles on a store-bought cake, trying not to show my disappointment. This pattern repeated itself throughout my childhood. Heather's achievements were celebrated extravagantly, mine were acknowledged with a distracted "that's nice." When I won first place in a local art competition in 8th grade, my father glanced at my painting and said, "It's too bad you don't apply this kind of focus to your math homework." As we grew older, I developed my own coping mechanisms. I embraced being the fun one, the creative spirit, the girl who made people laugh. Art became my refuge, the one place where my scattered thoughts and emotional intensity were assets rather than liabilities. I could spend hours lost in the flow of creating, the only time my busy mind felt truly at peace. There was one teacher, Ms. Jenkins, my high school art instructor, who saw something in me that my family didn't. "You have a unique perspective, Amber," she told me after class one day, examining a portrait I'd completed. "You see beneath the surface of things. That's a rare gift." For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of what Heather must experience all the time, the warm glow of genuine approval. But at home, the comparisons never stopped. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" became the soundtrack of my adolescence. Every report card, every parent-teacher conference, every family dinner seemed to reinforce the message: Heather was the successful daughter, and I was the disappointment. The first major blow came during my senior year of high school. Heather had attended Harvard on a partial scholarship, fulfilling my father's greatest ambition. When my college acceptance letters arrived, I didn't get into any of the prestigious universities my father had insisted I apply to. His disappointment was palpable, filling our house like a toxic fog for weeks. "I just don't understand," he said, pacing in his home office after my last rejection letter arrived. "We gave you and your sister the same opportunities. What went wrong with you?" His words stung, but they also sparked something inside me, a tiny flame of defiance. I'd been accepted to the Rhode Island School of Design, one of the top art schools in the country, with a substantial scholarship based on my portfolio. For the first time, I stood my ground. "I'm going to RISD, I told him, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm good at art, Dad. Really good. And I'm going to make a career of it." He looked at me like I'd announced I was joining the circus. "Art isn't a career, Amber. It's a hobby. You need something practical to fall back on." But for once, I didn't back down. That fall, while Heather was starting her prestigious job at a Boston consulting firm after graduating summa cum laude, I packed my beat-up Honda Civic and drove to Providence to begin my journey as an art student. As the years passed, the divide between my sister and me only grew wider. Heather continued her meteoric rise through the professional world. After Harvard, she earned her MBA from Wharton, then landed a job at Carlyle Consulting, one of the most prestigious firms in Boston. By 27, she was already leading her own team, with a corner office and salary that made my father burst with pride. She bought a beautiful brownstone in Beacon Hill, drove a luxury car, and seemed to embody everything my father valued: success, status, financial security. Meanwhile, I was struggling to find my footing at RISD. It wasn't that I lacked talent, my professors frequently praised my work, particularly my mixed media pieces that combined painting with found objects. But the structured environment of formal education still posed challenges for me. Deadlines were my nemesis. The administrative aspects of student life, forms, requirements, planning, all triggered my ADHD symptoms. I'd lose myself in creative projects for days, then suddenly realize I'd missed an important deadline for another class. "It's about responsibility, Amber," my father lectured during one of his visits, after I'd explained why I was on academic probation for a semester. "Your sister manages a team of 12 people and still finds time to train for marathons. You need to apply yourself." He never seemed to understand that my brain simply worked differently. What came easily to Heather was genuinely challenging for me, while my creative abilities were equally baffling to them. It was as if we spoke different languages, with no interpreter to bridge the gap. My mother tried to mediate, in her gentle way. "Your father just wants what's best for you," she'd say during our private phone calls. "He worries about your future." But even in her attempts to support me, I could hear the undertone: why couldn't I just be more like Heather? Why did I have to make things so difficult? After graduation, the real financial struggles began. My student loans came due while I was working entry-level jobs in galleries and as a freelance illustrator. The art world, I quickly discovered, was not meritocratic. Connections and privilege often mattered more than raw talent, and I had neither. I shared a cramped apartment with 3 roommates, ate ramen more often than not, and constantly juggled bills. During one particularly painful family dinner, when I'd come home for Thanksgiving, my father spent the entire meal talking about Heather's recent promotion. She'd just been made the youngest junior partner in her firm's history, and he couldn't contain his pride. "They're sending her to London next month to handle the Whitmore account," he announced, carving the turkey with precision. The CEO specifically requested her by name. I sat silently, pushing food around my plate, invisible as usual. I'd just had my first gallery feature the previous weekend, a small showing, but significant for an emerging artist. When I'd tried to share the news earlier, my father had nodded distractedly before turning the conversation back to Heather's accomplishments. After that dinner, something broke inside me. I could no longer pretend that things would improve, that my father would suddenly see value in my different path. The following January, I made a decision that shocked everyone. I moved to Chicago, over 1,000 miles from my family's judgmental gaze. "You're running away from responsibility," my father said during our last argument before I left. "No," I replied, finally finding my voice. "I'm running toward the only place I've ever felt valued, my art." Chicago offered a fresh start. The city's vibrant art scene was more accessible than New York's, the cost of living more manageable. I found work at a gallery in Wicker Park and rented a tiny studio apartment with just enough space for a bed and my art supplies. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. It was in Chicago that I met Jasmine, a ceramics artist who would become my closest friend. Unlike my family, Jasmine immediately understood and valued my creative mind. She saw my ADHD not as a defect but as part of what made my artistic perspective unique. "Your brain makes connections others don't see," she told me once, examining one of my collages. "That's why your work is so compelling." With Jasmine's encouragement, I began developing a more cohesive portfolio and submitting to smaller galleries. 9 months after moving to Chicago, I sold my first significant piece, a large mixed-media canvas that incorporated salvaged materials from abandoned buildings in my neighborhood. The buyer, a local restaurant owner, paid $2,000 and commissioned 2 more works. Elated, I called my parents that night, eager to share the validation I'd finally received. "That's nice, honey," my mother said, sounding genuinely pleased. Then my father took the phone. $2,000? That's good, I suppose, but when will you get a real job? Something with benefits and stability? Your sister just got a bonus that's probably 10 times that amount. The familiar ache returned, that hollow feeling in my chest that appeared whenever my accomplishments were measured against Heather's and found wanting. After that call, my communications with my parents became increasingly infrequent and superficial. Holiday visits became tense affairs that I dreaded for weeks in advance. The contrast between Heather's visits home and mine couldn't have been more stark. When she arrived, it was a celebration. My mother cooked her favorite meals, my father opened expensive wine and hung on her every word about corporate strategy and investment opportunities. When I visited, the conversation inevitably turned to my situation, well-meaning but painful interrogations about my financial security, my lack of health insurance, whether I was still doing the art thing. By my 26th birthday, I was seriously considering cutting contact entirely. What was the point of maintaining a relationship that left me feeling diminished and inadequate? Jasmine, who had her own complicated family history, understood my dilemma. "Families are tough," she said as we shared a bottle of cheap wine on my birthday. "But remember, you get to define the relationship now. You're an adult. You can set boundaries." I tried to take her advice, limiting calls and establishing topics that were off-limits. But the underlying dynamic remained unchanged. Heather was the success story, and I was the cautionary tale. The economic downturn hit the art world particularly hard. Galleries closed, collectors tightened their budgets, and corporate commissions dried up almost overnight. The gallery where I worked cut my hours from 40 to 20 per week, slashing my already modest income in half. My own art sales, which had been slowly but steadily increasing, came to an abrupt halt. Desperate to make rent, I took a second job as a barista at a coffee shop near my apartment. My days became an exhausting blur, mornings at the cafe starting at 5 a.m., afternoons and evenings at the gallery, and late nights in my studio, trying to create despite bone-deep fatigue. I'd collapse into bed around midnight only to wake 4 hours later and start the cycle again. Despite working 60-plus hours a week, I was barely treading water financially. Then came the final blow. My landlord posted a notice informing tenants that rent would increase by 30% when our leases renewed. There was no way I could afford the new amount, not with my reduced income. The Chicago rental market had become increasingly competitive, with application fees and security deposits that were far beyond my means. After a sleepless night weighing my options, I made a list of possibilities. I could find roommates, but most shared living situations required better credit than mine. I could move to a cheaper neighborhood, but that would mean a longer commute and less time for my art. I could take on a third job, but I was already working to the point of exhaustion. The final option on my list was the one I dreaded most: ask my family for help. Just temporarily, just enough to cover the increased rent while I found a better solution. The thought of approaching my father for money made my stomach churn. For years, he had measured my worth by my financial independence, or lack thereof. Asking for help would confirm everything he already believed about me. That I was irresponsible, impractical, a disappointment. But as the deadline for my lease renewal approached, I ran out of alternatives. With shaking hands, I dialed my parents' number one Sunday evening, rehearsing what I would say. Mitchell residence, my father answered, his voice formal as always. Hi, Dad. It's Amber. Amber? Well, this is a surprise. Your mother isn't home right now. She's at her book club. Actually, I was hoping to talk to you, I said, my throat tightening. I need some advice. This approach was deliberate. My father loved giving advice, viewing it as an opportunity to impart his wisdom. Of course, he said, his tone warming slightly. What's on your mind? I explained the situation as matter-of-factly as possible, emphasizing how hard I was working and framing the rent increase as an unexpected circumstance beyond my control. I mentioned that I just needed a temporary loan until the gallery returned to full hours or I found additional work. The silence that followed my explanation seemed to stretch for an eternity. Dad? Are you still there? I'm here, he replied, his voice noticeably cooler. I'm just trying to understand how you've put yourself in this position. Again. I'm working 2 jobs, I said, struggling to keep the defensiveness from my voice. The economy. The economy is affecting everyone, Amber. Your sister's company had layoffs last quarter, but she's doing fine because she planned ahead. She has savings, investments. She doesn't live paycheck to paycheck. I bit back the obvious retort, that Heather's 6-figure salary made saving a bit easier than my barely above minimum wage jobs. It would just be a loan, I said quietly. I'd pay you back as soon as. Your sister is successful and responsible unlike you, doesn't need help, he interrupted, each word precise and cutting. She made practical choices. She worked hard. This is what happens when you choose to follow your passion without a backup plan. The familiar pain bloomed in my chest, but now it was accompanied by something new, anger. Dad, I'm not asking for a handout. I'm asking for a temporary loan from my family. I've been working 60-hour weeks. I'm exhausted. I just need a little help to get through. And next month? What about the month after that? When does it end, Amber? When do you finally grow up and take responsibility for your choices? My mother's voice would typically interject at this point, softening his harshness. But she wasn't there, and the silence on the line told me he had no intention of relenting. I understand, I finally managed, my voice small. I'm sorry to have bothered you. Amber, listen, he sighed, his tone shifting to one of paternal condescension. Maybe this is the wake-up call you need. It's time to reconsider this art fantasy. Your sister could probably help you get an entry-level position at her firm. Something with a future. I need to go, I whispered, unable to bear another word. After hanging up, I sank to my kitchen floor and finally let the tears come. Years of feeling inadequate, of being compared and found wanting, crashed over me in waves. I cried until I had nothing left, until my eyes were swollen and my throat raw. Later that night, I called Heather, not to ask for money but simply seeking a sympathetic ear. Our relationship had always been complicated. I resented being compared to her, but I knew the comparisons weren't her fault. We'd grown closer since I'd moved away, occasionally talking without our parents' influence coloring every interaction. I heard you called Dad, she said when she answered, her voice carefully neutral. News traveled fast in the Mitchell family. Yeah. It didn't go well. He mentioned something about it, she said vaguely. Are you okay? Do you need to talk? I explained the situation, downplaying how desperate things had become. Heather made sympathetic noises, offered generic encouragement about how talented I was, how things would turn around. But she didn't offer help. The unspoken message was clear: she agreed with our father, at least in part. This was my problem to solve. "I'm sure something will work out," she said before ending the call. "You always land on your feet, right?" That night marked my lowest point. With nowhere else to turn, I called Jasmine and broke down explaining my situation. Without hesitation, she offered her couch until I figured things out. "It's not fancy, but it's yours as long as you need it," she said firmly. That's what friends are for. The contrast between my friend's immediate generosity and my family's rejection couldn't have been starker. Something crystallized inside me that night, a resolution that had been forming for years. I would no longer seek my family's approval or support. I would no longer measure my worth by their standards. Most importantly, I would no longer subject myself to the pain of their rejection. The next morning, I sent a brief email to my parents explaining that I needed space and would not be in contact for the foreseeable future. I didn't elaborate or justify, just stated my decision clearly and finally. Then I blocked their numbers, removed them from my social media, and began the painful process of building a life without the family that had never truly seen me. 6 months passed without contact from my family. At first, the silence was deafening. I'd reach for my phone to call my mother after a good day, only to remember our estrangement. But gradually, the sharp edges of that loss began to dull. I moved in with Jasmine temporarily, then found a roommate situation with another artist in a more affordable neighborhood. I picked up more hours at the cafe as the economy slowly improved, and I began selling art directly through online platforms, bypassing galleries and their substantial commissions. With Jasmine's encouragement, I also started therapy, working through the years of family trauma and learning to separate my self-worth from my father's approval. Slowly, I began to heal. I still thought about my family, still missed them despite everything, but the constant ache of inadequacy began to subside. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday in October, everything changed. I was working at the cafe when my phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer during my break. "Amber? It's Mom." Her voice sent a jolt through me, familiar yet strange after all these months. "Mom? How did you get this number?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Jasmine gave it to me," she replied, sounding uncharacteristically nervous. "I found her through the gallery website. Please don't be angry with her." I told her it was an emergency. The word emergency sent a spike of fear through me. "Is everyone okay? Are you sick? Is Dad?" "It's Heather," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "Oh, Amber, everything's falling apart." I didn't know who else to call. As my mother's story spilled out, I found myself sinking onto a bench outside the cafe, stunned by each new revelation. My perfect sister's perfect life was crumbling spectacularly. Carlyle Consulting, the prestigious firm where she'd built her career, was under federal investigation for financial fraud. Specifically, for falsifying client reports and misrepresenting investment outcomes to maintain their sterling reputation. "They're saying she knew," my mother whispered. "That she was part of it. There are emails, Amber. She's facing criminal charges." I felt like I'd stepped into an alternate reality. Heather, meticulous, rule-following Heather, involved in fraud? It seemed impossible. "What does Heather say?" I asked. "She says she was following orders, that everyone did it, that it was company culture." My mother's voice dropped even lower. "Your father is in complete denial. He's convinced it's a witch hunt, that she's being scapegoated. He's hired expensive lawyers, but..." She trailed off. "But what, Mom? The evidence doesn't look good." And that's not all. What followed was a litany of shocking revelations. Behind the facade of success, Heather's life had been unraveling for years. Her perfect brownstone was underwater on its mortgage, with 3 months of missed payments. She had maxed out credit cards, personal loans, even a secret second mortgage. She'd been living dramatically beyond her means, maintaining the appearance of success while drowning in debt. "We had no idea," my mother said, sounding shell-shocked. She never said a word. Always told us everything was wonderful. Her husband had been begging her to cut back, to be honest with us, but she couldn't bear to disappoint your father. The irony was almost too much to process. All those years of being the family disappointment, and Heather had been living a lie to maintain her golden child status. "Her marriage is falling apart too," my mother continued. "Thomas moved out last week. He says he can't handle the stress, the legal issues, the financial mess. He's filing for divorce." I closed my eyes, trying to absorb it all. Part of me, a small, wounded part one wasn't proud of, felt vindicated. The sister who had everything, who had been held up as the model I should aspire to, had been living a house of cards. But mostly, I felt a surprising surge of concern for Heather. Despite everything, she was still my sister. "What can I do?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. "Would you come home?" My mother's voice was pleading. "Just for a family meeting." "Your father he's not handling this well. And Heather keeps asking for you. She says you're the only one who might understand." The request sent a whirlwind of conflicting emotions through me. Return to the house where I'd always felt inadequate? Face my father after his cruel dismissal? And yet, something about this dramatic reversal of fortunes felt significant, a turning point I shouldn't ignore. "When?" I asked finally. "This weekend? We could pay for your flight." 3 days later, I found myself standing on my parents' doorstep, feeling like a stranger. The house looked exactly the same, the meticulously maintained colonial where I'd grown up, with its perfectly pruned hedges and gleaming brass door knocker. But I was different, and apparently, so was my family. My mother answered the door, looking a decade older than when I'd last seen her. She embraced me wordlessly, holding on a beat too long before ushering me inside. The living room, typically immaculate, showed subtle signs of disorder, newspapers scattered on the coffee table, a forgotten coffee mug on the side table. And then I saw Heather, sitting small and hunched in our father's leather armchair. My seemingly invincible older sister looked broken. She'd lost weight, her designer clothes hanging loosely on her frame. Her typically perfect hair was pulled back in a careless ponytail, her face makeup-free and haggard. Our eyes met, and I saw something I'd never witnessed in Heather before: shame. My father entered last, and the sight of him was equally shocking. The commanding presence that had dominated my childhood seemed diminished somehow. He nodded stiffly in my direction but didn't meet my eyes. "Thank you for coming, Amber," he said formally, as if addressing a business associate rather than his daughter. The family meeting began with my father laying out Heather's situation as if presenting a case in court. His voice remained steady as he detailed the allegations, the potential consequences, the legal strategy. But beneath his controlled exterior, I could see he was still in denial, still defending Heather despite mounting evidence. "This is clearly a case of making an example of someone," he insisted. "Your sister was following established company protocols. If there was wrongdoing, it was at the executive level, not hers." Heather stared at the floor, saying nothing to contradict him, but her body language told a different story. This wasn't the confident, self-assured sister I remembered. This was someone drowning in consequences she never thought she'd face. I sat silently, taking it all in, wondering why I was really there. Was I supposed to offer absolution? Financial help? Or was I simply an audience for my father's performance of unwavering family support, the very support he'd denied me? Little did I know, the real confrontation was yet to come. The family meeting continued in our living room, tension thickening the air with each passing minute. My father continued his defense of Heather, constructing elaborate explanations for every damning piece of evidence. My mother sat beside him, nodding occasionally, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Heather remained silent, a ghost of her former self. "The important thing is that we present a united front," my father concluded, finally looking directly at me. This will all blow over eventually, but until then, we need to support your sister unconditionally. The irony of his words hit me like a physical blow. Support your sister unconditionally. The same sister who had received unconditional support her entire life, while I had received only judgment and comparison. Heather, I said quietly, ignoring my father's speech. What actually happened? I want to hear it from you. My sister looked up, startled by the direct question. Her eyes darted to our father, then back to me. She began, then stopped, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad, could I talk to Amber alone for a minute? That's not necessary, he replied quickly. We're family. We can discuss everything together. Please, Heather insisted, a note of desperation in her voice I'd never heard before. Just 10 minutes. Reluctantly, my parents left the room, my father casting a warning glance at Heather before closing the door behind them. The moment they were gone, my sister's carefully maintained composure crumbled. Tears filled her eyes, and her shoulders began to shake. I'd been living a lie to make Dad proud, she confessed, the words tumbling out as if she'd been holding them back for years. All of it, Amber. The perfect job, the perfect house, the perfect life. It was all a facade. She explained how the pressure had started small, fudging numbers on quarterly reports to meet impossible targets, telling clients what they wanted to hear rather than the truth about their investments. Everyone did it, she said. It was expected. If you didn't play along, you were out. But the deception hadn't stopped at work. To maintain the lifestyle our father admired, the lifestyle that earned his approval, she'd stretched beyond her means, accumulating debt she couldn't possibly repay. I couldn't bear to disappoint him, she whispered. You don't know what it's like, being the golden child. The expectations never stop. One success just raises the bar for the next one. But I did know, in a way. I knew exactly what it felt like to be measured against an impossible standard and found wanting. Why didn't you ever say anything? I asked. All those years, I thought you had everything figured out. I envied you, she admitted, the confession seemingly shocking her as much as it did me. Your courage to pursue what you loved, even when Dad disapproved. Your authenticity. I was so busy being who everyone expected me to be that I lost myself somewhere along the way. Before I could respond, the door opened, and our parents returned. My father immediately sensed something had shifted. What's going on? He demanded, looking between us suspiciously. Something snapped inside me then, a lifetime of suppressed feelings suddenly demanding to be heard. What's going on, I said, rising to my feet, is that I'm finally seeing the truth about this family. About you, Dad. Amber, my mother cautioned, but I was beyond stopping. All my life, you've held Heather up as the perfect daughter and treated me like a disappointment, I continued, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. You've criticized every choice I've made, dismissed my art as a hobby, made me feel worthless because I didn't follow the path you approved of. That's not fair, my father began, but I cut him off. It's completely fair. 6 months ago, when I asked for help, just a temporary loan during a crisis, you told me Heather was successful and responsible unlike me. You said she didn't need help. Well, guess what? She needed help too. She was drowning, but she was too afraid of your disapproval to admit it. My father's face flushed with anger. This is completely inappropriate. Your sister is facing a serious situation, and you're making it about yourself. I'm making it about the truth, I countered. About the damage your impossible standards have done to both your daughters. Look at us, Dad. I cut off contact with my family rather than face more judgment. Heather committed fraud rather than admit she couldn't meet your expectations. Is that the family you wanted to create? The room fell silent, my words hanging in the air like smoke. Then, to my astonishment, my mother spoke up. She's right, James. Her voice was quiet but firm. We've done this to our girls. Both of them. My father stared at her, betrayal written across his features. Catherine, you can't possibly. I can and I do, she interrupted, something I'd never witnessed in their marriage. I've stood by for years while you favored one daughter and dismissed the other. I said nothing when you turned every holiday into an inquisition about Amber's choices. I watched you put Heather on a pedestal so high she couldn't possibly keep her balance. And now look where we are. My father's face went from red to white. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. Into this charged silence, Heather's voice emerged, small but clear. I've thought about killing myself. All heads whipped toward her, the shocking confession freezing us in place. The night before the investigators came to my office, she continued, staring at her hands. I stood on my balcony and calculated how many seconds it would take to hit the ground. The only thing that stopped me was knowing how disappointed you would be, Dad. Even in that, I couldn't bear to fail you. My father made a strangled sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. The mighty James Mitchell, who always had an answer for everything, was speechless. I crossed the room and knelt beside Heather's chair, taking her trembling hands in mine. I'm so sorry, I whispered. I had no idea. How could you? She replied. We never really knew each other. We were too busy being the characters in Dad's story, the success and the disappointment. After everyone had recovered from the shock of Heather's confession, my father retreated to his study, the door closing with a decisive click. My mother went to make tea, her solution to every crisis, big or small. Heather and I were left alone in the living room, years of unspoken feelings between us. What happens now? I asked softly. I don't know, she admitted. The lawyers say I might avoid jail time if I cooperate with the investigation, but my career is over. The house will be foreclosed. My marriage. She trailed off, then shook her head. Everything I built my identity around is gone. Maybe that's not entirely a bad thing, I suggested carefully. Now you get to figure out who you really are, not who Dad wanted you to be. She looked at me with something like wonder. How did you do it? Break free? It wasn't by choice, I said with a rueful smile. Being the family disappointment has its advantages. When you're already failing to meet expectations, you have nothing left to lose. For the first time that day, Heather smiled, a small, fragile thing, but genuine. Will you help me? I don't even know where to start. I thought about all the years of resentment, of feeling second best, of nursing wounds inflicted by comparisons. Then I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw not the perfect daughter who had everything, but a woman as damaged by our father's expectations as I was, just in different ways. Yes, I said finally. We should have been allies all along. Maybe it's not too late to start. We made a pact that evening, sitting in our childhood living room surrounded by the wreckage of facades and pretenses. Whatever happened next, we would face it together. The golden child and the disappointment, finally seeing each other clearly, and choosing to stand side by side. The months that followed were anything but easy. Heather's legal situation was complex and frightening. I took a leave of absence from my jobs in Chicago and temporarily moved back to Boston to help her navigate the crisis. Together, we found her a criminal defense attorney who specialized in white-collar cases, not the high-profile, aggressive lawyer my father had hired, but someone who focused on negotiation and damage control rather than denials. You need to be honest, I told her after a particularly grueling meeting with the prosecutor. About everything. No more facades. Heather followed that advice, cooperating fully with the investigation. She provided emails and documentation that implicated senior executives who had pressured junior partners like her to falsify reports. Her cooperation, combined with her previously clean record, made a significant difference. Instead of jail time, she received 3 years of probation, substantial financial penalties, and 200 hours of community service. The financial consequences were severe. Heather lost her professional licenses, her home went into foreclosure, and her divorce from Thomas was finalized with a settlement that left her with little more than her personal belongings. With nowhere else to go, we found a modest two-bedroom apartment that we could afford together, a far cry from her Beacon Hill brownstone or my Chicago studio, but a new beginning for both of us. Our father struggled to accept the new reality. The story he had constructed about our family, successful attorney father, supportive mother, brilliant elder daughter, disappointing younger daughter, had been shattered beyond repair. He retreated into himself, spending long hours in his study, emerging only for meals that passed in uncomfortable silence. My mother, however, underwent a remarkable transformation. Without my father's overwhelming presence dictating family dynamics, she began to find her voice. One evening, about 2 months after I'd returned to Boston, she came to our apartment for dinner, alone, without my father. "I owe you an apology," she said, looking directly at me. "I failed you as a mother. I saw how your father's favoritism hurt you, and I did nothing to stop it. I told myself I was keeping the peace, but really, I was just being a coward." Her candor startled me. This wasn't the cautious, conflict-avoiding mother I'd grown up with. "I'm seeing a therapist," she continued, answering my unasked question. "For the first time in my life. I should have done it years ago." She was apologizing to Heather too, in her way. "I put so much pressure on you to be perfect," she told my sister. "I lived vicariously through your achievements instead of helping you find your own path." Meanwhile, I continued my art career remotely, building my online presence and submitting work to Boston galleries. The unexpected twist? My work was evolving, deepening in ways I hadn't anticipated. The family crisis had unlocked something in my creativity, a new emotional depth, a more nuanced understanding of human complexity. I created a series of mixed media pieces exploring the theme of identity and expectation that received significant attention in local art circles. Heather was on her own journey of discovery. With her finance career in ruins, she had to rebuild her professional identity from scratch. I suggested she start by identifying what she actually enjoyed, separate from our father's expectations. "I don't even know what I like," she admitted one evening as we sat in our small shared living room. "I've spent so long doing what I was supposed to do that I never figured out what I wanted." "So experiment," I encouraged her. "Try things. Fail at them. It's liberating." Taking my advice, Heather began volunteering at a community center, teaching financial literacy to low-income families, ironically finding that she actually enjoyed finance when it was used to help people rather than maximize profits. She enrolled in education courses at a local college, considering a career change to teaching. Slowly, she began to discover her authentic self beneath the perfect daughter persona she'd maintained for decades. The most surprising development came nearly 6 months after Heather's legal troubles began. I received a text from my mother, "Your father found your website. He's been looking at your art for hours." I didn't know what to make of this information. My online portfolio had been active for years, but my father had never shown any interest in viewing it. What had changed? A few days later, I received an email from him, formal, stiff, but unmistakably an attempt at connection. He mentioned a specific piece in my portfolio, a textured canvas that incorporated torn legal documents and blueprint fragments, titled Foundations. "The layering technique is quite sophisticated," he wrote. "The juxtaposition of structured elements with more organic forms creates an interesting tension." Coming from my attorney father, who had previously dismissed my art as splashing paint around, this represented a seismic shift. He had actually looked at my work. Really looked at it. And found something worth commenting on. I showed the email to Heather, who smiled sadly. "He's trying," she said. "In his own way." The real breakthrough came at my first major gallery showing in Boston. I hadn't told my parents about it, not wanting to face my father's dismissal or, worse, polite disinterest. But as I was speaking with a potential buyer, I looked up to see my parents standing awkwardly near the entrance. My mother was beaming with obvious pride, while my father surveyed the crowded gallery with an expression I couldn't quite read. Later, as I explained the concept behind my exhibition to a small group, I noticed my father standing at the periphery, listening intently. When the crowd dispersed, he approached one of my larger pieces, a complex work that incorporated legal texts, financial reports, and family photographs, partially obscured by layers of paint and resin. "This is about us, isn't it?" he asked quietly. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "It's powerful," he said, the word clearly unfamiliar in the context of discussing art. "I never understood before what you were trying to say." It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But from my father, it was an admission, an acknowledgement that perhaps he had missed something important all these years. Heather, meanwhile, was undergoing her own transformation. Free from the crushing weight of pretense, she discovered a passion for education that had been buried beneath years of corporate ambition. She began substitute teaching at a local high school while working toward her teaching certification, finding fulfillment in connecting with students who struggled with traditional academic environments. "I think I'm good at this," she told me one evening, surprised by her own enjoyment. "I understand the kids who don't fit the mold because I spent my whole life trying to fit one that wasn't right for me." Our relationship as sisters was transforming too. The competitiveness that had defined our childhood, mostly imposed by our father, gave way to genuine support. We discovered shared interests we'd never explored and developed inside jokes that baffled our parents. For the first time, we were becoming not just sisters but friends. My mother flourished in this new family dynamic. She rejoined her old book club, took up watercolor painting, and began voicing her opinions without constantly deferring to my father. It was as if the family crisis had freed her as well, allowing her to step out of the supporting role she'd occupied for decades. My father's evolution was slower, more halting. He still struggled with the collapse of his carefully constructed worldview. But there were moments, brief, precious moments, when I glimpsed the possibility of a new relationship. Like when he awkwardly complimented a commissioned piece I'd completed, or when he asked a genuine question about my creative process instead of inquiring when I'd get a real job. During one family dinner, less tense than previous gatherings but still somewhat stilted, he surprised us all by raising his glass in a toast. "To my daughters," he said, his voice gruff with uncharacteristic emotion. "Heather, who has shown remarkable courage in rebuilding her life. And Amber, whose artistic talent I failed to recognize for too long." It wasn't everything. It didn't erase years of hurt or magically transform our family. But it was a beginning, an acknowledgement that perhaps the metrics by which he had measured success and worth had been flawed all along. That night, as Heather and I walked back to our shared apartment, she linked her arm through mine. "Do you think we'll ever have a normal family?" she asked. I laughed softly. "I'm not sure normal families exist. But maybe we can build something new. Something better." 1 year after the day my father uttered those cruel words, "Your sister is successful and responsible unlike you, doesn't need help," our family had transformed in ways none of us could have imagined. The facade had cracked, painful truths had emerged, and from the wreckage, something more authentic was slowly taking shape. My art career had reached a stability I'd never experienced before. The Boston exhibition led to connections with galleries in New York and Philadelphia. My online presence grew, bringing commissions from collectors who appreciated my exploration of family dynamics, expectation, and identity. For the first time in my adult life, I was financially secure, able to afford my own apartment not far from Heather's new place. My sister's transformation was even more profound. After completing her teaching certification, she secured a position teaching economics and personal finance at a public high school in a working-class neighborhood. The salary was a fraction of what she'd earned at Carlisle Consulting, but the satisfaction she derived was immeasurable. "I'm using my knowledge to actually help people," she told me over coffee one Saturday morning. "Not to make rich people richer or to impress Dad, but to give these kids tools they can use in real life." She had a particular affinity for students with learning differences, perhaps because she recognized in them the sister she had never truly known growing up. She developed creative teaching methods for visual learners and those with attention issues, drawing on what she had learned about my experiences with ADHD. "I wish I'd understood you better when we were kids," she said once. maybe we wouldn't have lost so many years. Our parents were changing too, in their own ways. My mother had rediscovered interests and passions long set aside in service to my father's career and expectations. She took a part-time position at a local library, joined a community garden, and began speaking her mind with a frankness that occasionally startled all of us. My father's journey was the most difficult, as it required dismantling beliefs and values he'd held his entire life. His identity had been so thoroughly entwined with professional success and social status that their sudden absence left him adrift. But slowly, incrementally, he was finding his way toward a different understanding of worth and fulfillment. The most visible sign of this evolution was his changed relationship with Heather and me. The constant comparisons had ceased. Instead of measuring us against each other or against some external standard of success, he was learning, with considerable effort, to see and appreciate us as individuals. During a family dinner at my apartment, as I served a dessert I'd prepared, my father said something that nearly caused me to drop the serving dish. "You know," he remarked, studying the elaborate tart I'd placed before him, "your attention to detail in cooking reminds me of your art. That same care and creativity. I should have seen the connection sooner." It wasn't a grand declaration of understanding or a tearful apology. Coming from my father, it was something more valuable, a genuine effort to see me as I was, not as he had wanted me to be. Our family dynamic had fundamentally shifted. The rigid hierarchy, successful father at the top, followed by golden child Heather, supportive mother, and disappointing Amber at the bottom, had dissolved. In its place was something more fluid, more egalitarian, and ultimately more supportive. We established new traditions that reflected this change. Instead of formal holiday dinners where achievements were tallied and compared, we began having monthly family brunches where the focus was simply on connection. Heather and I started a tradition of Sister Sundays, alternating between art galleries and bookstores, followed by coffee and conversation. One particularly meaningful evening, my father invited me to his study, formerly a forbidden space where important work happened, now just a room in their increasingly downsized life. From his desk drawer, he withdrew a newspaper clipping. "I saved this," he said, handing me a review of my first major Boston exhibition. The critic had praised my unflinching examination of family mythology and sophisticated layering of meaning and material. The clipping was worn at the edges, as if frequently handled. My father had not only read it but had kept it, treasured it even. It was such a small thing, but it spoke volumes about his efforts to understand the daughter he had so long misunderstood. The journey wasn't always smooth. Old patterns occasionally reasserted themselves, particularly during times of stress. My father still sometimes lapsed into judgment, my mother into passivity, Heather into perfectionism, and I into defensive withdrawal. But now we recognized these patterns for what they were and worked to disrupt them, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The most important lesson I learned through all of this was about the difference between authentic success and the appearance of success. Heather had achieved everything our father valued: prestigious education, high-paying career, beautiful home, and had been miserable, driven to the brink of self-destruction by the pressure to maintain that facade. I had been deemed the failure, the disappointment, for choosing a path authentic to my nature but at odds with my father's values. Yet that authenticity had ultimately been my salvation, allowing me to build a life that truly reflected who I was rather than who someone else thought I should be. "You were right," Heather told me one evening as we sat on her small balcony, watching the sunset. "All those years ago when you stood your ground and went to art school. You knew yourself better than any of us did." The truth was more complicated. I hadn't been particularly self-aware or courageous, I had simply been unable to force myself into a mold that wasn't shaped for me. My neurodivergence, which my father had seen as a flaw to be overcome, had actually protected me from losing myself entirely in his expectations. Perhaps the most profound change was in how we all defined success. My father, who had once measured it in degrees, titles, and income, was beginning to recognize other metrics: fulfillment, authenticity, connection. My mother was discovering that having opinions and desires of her own didn't destroy her family but enriched it. Heather was learning that being imperfect, even failing occasionally, wasn't the catastrophe she had feared. And I was finally understanding that standing firm in my identity wasn't selfish or irresponsible, it was necessary and even brave in a family that had demanded conformity. During one of our now regular family gatherings, my father pulled me aside. It had been nearly 18 months since his cutting comment had severed our relationship, and so much had changed in that time. "I need to say something to you," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Something I should have said long ago." I braced myself, unsure what was coming. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About you. About what makes a life worthwhile. I was measuring success by such a narrow standard that I couldn't see the value in your choices. I'm sorry, Amber. Truly sorry." It wasn't a perfect moment of resolution. One apology couldn't erase decades of dismissal and disappointment. But it was honest, and in that honesty lay the possibility of a new relationship, not idealized or perfect, but real. As I look back on this journey, I'm struck by how the family crisis that seemed like an ending became instead a beginning. The painful collapse of facades and expectations created space for something more authentic to grow. We're still learning, still making mistakes, still occasionally falling into old patterns. But we're doing it together, with greater awareness and compassion than before. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this: the metrics by which others measure your worth, even those closest to you, may have nothing to do with what will actually bring you fulfillment and joy. The courage to define success on your own terms, to follow your own path even when it's devalued by those around you, is perhaps life's greatest challenge and its most important achievement. Have you ever had to stand your ground against family expectations? Or discovered that someone you envied was actually struggling beneath a perfect facade? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if my story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that being the family disappointment might actually be their greatest strength. Thank you for listening, and remember, authentic success isn't about meeting others' expectations, but about being true to yourself, even when it's the harder path.